Hey, what's going on, guys? So I was looking around for ideas and resources for different projects that I could create for YouTube, and I ran across this tool called Pa11y or Pa11y, which is an accessibility tester. So basically, you can pass in any URL to a website, and it will basically just return results of it'll be an array of issues that have to do with accessibility. So things like if you forgot to put an alt tag on an image, or if you forgot like the for attribute on a label. So anything that has to do with accessibility, it returns all the errors or issues. So what I want to do is use Pa11y along with node.js to create a simple API, a simple backend that we can hit to get the results for any website we want, and then create a front end to display those results. So this is the front end here, and we're just going to use HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript along with Bootstrap just for a very simple UI stuff. And we'll basically be able to put in a website here. And I've created just a very simple, crap website at traversy.dev that we could test. So traversy.dev, and I purposely left in some issues. So I'm going to click submit here, and you'll see we get a little spinner while it checks. And then we get a list of all of the accessibility issues. So an example right here, we have an image element is missing an alt attribute. And what it does is it gives us the message, but it also shows us the context. So it gives us the HTML where that error is. And then we also have a specific code for each issue as well. So this one here, this element has insufficient contrast. So it'll even look at like, text contrast and report back if it's too light for people that are visually impaired. In fact, I'll just show you traversy.dev, and this is what we're testing, and you can see how the text is really light. So obviously, people that are visually impaired can't see that very well. But yeah, so that's what we're going to build, and we're going to be using node.js along with Pa11y. Pa11y is basically the workhorse for this application, but I think it'd be fun to just create a front end, use some vanilla JavaScript to make the request using the fetch API, get the data back, show it in the DOM. We have a little loading spinner for when it's checking. And of course, you could use React or some other framework if you want, but I wanted everyone to be able to do this regardless of what framework you're into. So that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first step in creating our website accessibility tester is setting up our Backend API, which is going to be pretty simple because we're just using this Pa11y package, Pa11y. This is the GitHub page for it. And basically, we just bring it in, and then we call Pa11y as a function, pass in a URL, and then we get all the results or all the issues. And then we can simply send that to our front end, which we're going to be using vanilla JavaScript, but of course you could use React, Vue, or whatever you'd like. So let's jump into VS Code, and I have a folder called Website Accessibility Tester. And we're going to go ahead and open up the integrated terminal, and I'm going to run npm init-y. That's going to create our package.json. And then let's install our dependencies. So we want Express, and then we want Pa11y, which is Pa11y. All right, so now that that's installed, let's go ahead and create our index.js. So touch index.js, or you can call it whatever you want. This is just an entry point to our backend. Now, before we get into creating our Express server with the route, I just want to test out Pa11y. So let's go ahead and bring it in. So we want to require Pa11y, and make sure you use Pa11y, they're not L's. And Pa11y returns a promise, so we're going to have an async function here, so we can use async await. We'll just call this run. And then we'll have a variable with our response. We want to await Pa11y, and that takes in a URL, and I have a test URL that I want to use, which is just traversy.dev. And then I'm just going to return, console log that response so we can see what that gives us. Okay, and then we'll call run down here. So let's come into our console and we'll run node index, and it might just take a couple seconds. And then let's see what we get returned here. So we get an object that has a document title, so whatever's in the title tags, I just threw in my website, the page URL, and then we have an array of issues. And each issue is an object that has a code, so each issue has a specific code, the type code, And then what we're really interested in is the message and the context. So as you can see, this message says the image element is missing an alt attribute. And then it shows us the context, which is the image that's missing the alt attribute. So this is some very helpful information. It also shows you the selector, runner extras, but really we're interested in these two. That's what we're going to be displaying on our page. We'll display the code as well, but this is really what tells you what's wrong. So there's some other issues here, like this one, this element has insufficient contrast. So basically, if your text is too light and it's not readable, it'll pick it up and it will report that as an issue. Down here, anchor element found without a valid href. This form doesn't contain a submit button. This one here, the text input element does not have a name available. And then finally, we have this form should be labeled in some way, so use the label element. So now what we want to do is create an API with a route that we can get so that we can hit and then get this data, okay? And we want to be able to pass the URL as a query param. So we can keep the import of Pa11y, but let's get rid of this. And we'll go ahead and bring in Express as well. And then we'll create a port for this to run on. So let's check process.env.port. That'll look in the environment variable first. And if that's not there, then we'll run it on 5000. And then let's go ahead and initialize Express. Okay, and then we want to run our server. So let's do app.listen, and we want to listen on that port. And we'll also just have a callback in here and just do a console log and pass some backticks, and we'll say server started on port and then that port variable. Now for the route, let's say app.get, and I'm making it a get request and we pass the URL with a query param, but if you want, it could be a post request and you could pass the URL in the body. It's really up to you. So this will be a get request to, let's do /API/test, not text, test. And then we'll have our request response, our function. And the way we're going to do this, I'm just going to open up Postman. We're going to use that to test it out anyways. So I'll just open up a new tab here. We're going to make a get request, and it'll be HTTP localhost or whatever our domain is, in this case localhost 5000. Get rid of that. So localhost 5000 /API/test. And the way I want to include the URL is with a query param or a query string. So we do question mark, and then we'll have URL equals, and then, you know, whatever the URL is, in this case, traversy.dev. So it'll look like this. Now the way that we grab this in Express is going to be with request or req.query and then whatever we called it, in this case URL. So we want to have an if statement here because I want to make sure that that's included. So let's say if not, request.query.url. So if that doesn't exist, then let's respond with a status of 400 because that's a client error. And then we'll add JSON here, and we'll just have an object with error, and we'll say URL is required. And then in the else, we'll have we'll get our results, say const results, and we're using a sync await with Pa11y. So let's make this function asynchronous. And then down here we can do await, and just like we did before, we'll call Pa11y, and we're going to pass in here the request.query.url. And then we just want to respond with those results. So we'll say we'll do res.status 200 and then .json, and we'll send those results. All right, so it's as easy as that. Now the front end, when we build it, it's going to go in a static folder called public. So I'm just going to add the middleware for that. Let's say app.use express.static, and the folder we're going to use is going to be called public. Okay, and like I said, you can use React or Vue or Svelte, whatever you want. I'm just using vanilla JavaScript so that I can, you know, because some of you might not use React or whatever. So let's go ahead and last thing I want to do here is in our package.json, we'll add a start script. And let's get rid of this. And this is going to run node index. Okay, so that'll run the index file. And then down here, let's go ahead and run npm start to start our server. Okay, it started on 5,000, and then we're going to go to Postman, and I'm first going to try it without the URL. So if I send that, you can see we get a 400 bad request, and it's a bad request because we need the URL. We're not sending that. So we get the error. If I send it with that, it's going to take a couple seconds, and then you can see we get back all the data that Pa11y gets for us. So that's it. Our API is done. Now we want to build the front end to display what we need to. We also want to have a form where we can enter whatever URL we want. So we know this is working. We can close that up. And we set public as a static folder. So let's go ahead and create a folder now called public. And inside here we'll have our index.html. And we shouldn't need a CSS file because we're going to use Bootstrap, but you can create one if you want. We do need a JavaScript file, so let's create a folder called JS, and in here we're going to create our main.js, so that's going to be our front-end JavaScript file. So in the index.html, let's just create a boilerplate here, and for the title, let's say website accessibility tester, and we're going to use Bootstrap, so let's just search for Bootstrap CDN, and I just want the CSS, so this link right here, I'm going to copy that and just put that right in the head here, so we'll paste that in. Okay, and then down in the body, let's be sure to include our script, so let's say script source, and that's going to be in JS, main.js, and then for now we'll just do a hello. Okay, now we should be able to go to localhost 5000, and we should now see hello. Alright, so we're going to just do the HTML real quick. If you don't want to follow along, you could always just copy it from the repository, the link in the description. But let's go ahead and add a container. We're going to do container -sm, and in that container we're going to have a card. Let's do a class of my5 that's margin on the top and bottom. We'll do padding 3, bg dark, and let's do text -light. So that'll be our card, and then we want a card body class inside that, and in the card body we'll have an h2 with margin bottom 3, and we'll say website accessibility tester, and then under that h2 is going to be our form, and I'm just going to give the form an ID of form. We don't need an action, and inside the form here we're going to have an input -group, and let's also do mb3. Alright, and then inside that div with the input group we're going to have our input, and this is going to be a type of URL. So that way we have some validation, and it has to be a URL. We don't want a name. ID is going to be URL, and let's add for class, we're going to have our input, form control class, and then let's also add a placeholder, and we'll just say enter a website. All right. Now we can check this out. Let's go back here and reload. Good. And we'll just make this a little smaller, and we'll open up the JavaScript file, and then we can just close that sidebar up. So we want to have a button as well in this input group. So let's go right under the input, and let's create a button, and we'll give this a type of submit. And then for class, let's do btn and then btn-primary. And for text, we'll just say submit. So that'll give us a button. Cool. And then that should do it for the top part. Now we want to go still within the container, but underneath this card. So it'll be right before this last div here. And we're going to have two things here. One is going to be the loader. So we're going to use the Bootstrap spinner for when it's fetching the request. And then we need a placeholder for our actual issues. So let's create the loader first. We'll have a class of loader and text-center. And then in here, we're going to add spinner dash border, and we'll give this a role of status. And then inside that div, we're going to have a span, and this is going to have a class of visually dash hidden. And this is just for the bootstrap spinner. And in here, we'll say loading dot dot dot. All right, so if we save that and we reload, we're going to see the spinner. Now we want that hidden by default. So what I'll do, since it's, this is the only custom CSS we're going to be using, so I'm just going to put it up here in some style tags. So I'll grab the loader, and we're going to set the display, set that to none, so that we don't see that right now. So if I reload, that should go away for now. And the very last thing that we want is underneath the loader, which ends here, we're going to have a div with the ID of issues. And that's where we want to output all of our issues. So that's it for the HTML. Let's close that up. And we're going to have 4 different functions. So I'm just going to map those out and put comments so you know exactly what we're doing. So this one is going to fetch, let's say, fetch accessibility issues. So that's going to hit our back end and fetch the issues. Then we want a function to, let's say, add issues to the DOM. And we're going to have a function to set the loading state, because we want to have that spinner show when it's actually fetching and loading, and then when we get the data back, we'll have it go away. And then we're also going to have a function to escape HTML, because if you remember, we get back in the objects, the issues objects, we have a context that has HTML tags in it. And I want to display that, but I don't want it to render the HTML, so we'll have a function to escape it. All right, now down here, I'm going to select the form. So we'll say document query selector, and we have an ID of form, and we want to add an event listener onto that. And what we want to listen for is a submit. And when we submit the form, we want to call a function. I'm going to call test accessibility. And that's going to go up here. So I'm going to use arrow functions, but you can use regular functions if you want. So let's say test accessibility, and this is going to be an async function because we are going to make a fetch request. It's going to take in an event parameter as well, and then we have to call e.prevent default since it's a submit. Okay, and then let's create a variable for the input value. So we'll call this we'll just call it URL, and we'll set this to document.query selector, and that has an ID of URL, but since it's an input, we want to make sure we get the value, so dot value. And then for now, let's just console log URL. So we do have to reload. Let's come over here and let's open up our console, and if I just type anything in here that's not a URL, we're going to get this because we did give it a type of URL. Although if we submit nothing, it does submit, so we do have to check for that. If I put in a URL, I already have this saved as a drop down here, so I'll submit that, and you can see now it's going to print out the URL. So let's come over here and let's check to make sure that that's not empty first of all. So we'll say let's say if the URL is equal to an empty string, then we'll just go ahead and do an alert, and we'll say please add a URL, and then we'll do an else. So here we want to, this is where we want to make our fetch request, but I want to create the set loading function because I want to show the spinner if, right before we actually make the request. So let's go right here and let's create a function called set loading. And the way I'm going to do this is I want it to have, it's going to take in, let's say, is loading, and I want to set that to true by default so that if we want to set it to true, we don't actually have to pass this in. If we want to set it to false, then we just have to pass in false. So now in here, let's go ahead and grab the loader from the DOM. So we'll do document.query selector, and we're going to grab the ID of loader. And then we want to check is loading. Okay, so we want to see if that's true or false. If it's true, then let's take the loader and let's set the style. So we want to do style, and then we want to set the display attribute to block to show it. Else, then we want to show We want this to be none, and it's none by default. All right, so now if we go up here in our else, we're going to call set loading before we actually make our request, and that should set it to true. So if I reload this and we pass something in and submit, can I read properties of null, style? Oh, it's a class of loader, not an ID. All right, let's try that again. And now we should just see the spinner. And it's going to stay like that because we set it to true, and that's it. So we can reload to get that to go away. And now let's go back up into our test accessibility and go under set loading. And then we want to get our response, or make our request, put the response in here. So we'll say await fetch. And we're going to hit our backend. So let's pass in some backticks. And it's going to be API. It's on the same domain, so API/test, and then we want to pass in a query param of URL, and we're going to set that to the actually we need to do money sign brackets and then pass in URL. All right, so that's going to pass in whatever is typed into the form as a query param. Now here I want to just make sure that we get back a successful response. So we can do that by taking the response, and it should have a status on it. And we want to say if that's not equal to 200, okay, 200 is a success. If it's not equal to that, then first of all, let's set loading to false because we want to stop the spinner. And then let's just do an alert and say, we'll just say something, yeah, we'll just say something went wrong. All right, and then else. So if it was successful, then we want to get the data. So we want to say data and then await the response, and we want the JSON data. Now, if you remember what it gives us back, it's an object that has like the title, and then it has an array called issues. So what I'm going to do is actually just destructure that data and take out issues because that's all we need. So now we should have access to those issues. Now we'll have a function called add issues to DOM, and we'll pass in those issues. And then we just want to set loading. We're going to set loading to false. And now let's come down here and let's create that function. So let's say const add issues to DOM, and that's going to take in issues. And then just for now, let's console log issues, just to make sure everything's working up to this point. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in that URL and submit. We get our loader, and then as soon as it's done requesting, the loader goes away, and now we're logging our issues. Okay, so now we just basically want to get these and put them into the DOM so that they display. So let's come back over here and let's create a variable. We'll call this issues output, and we want to grab from the DOM document.query selector, and we have an ID of issues. Whoops, ID of issues. Okay, and then first thing we'll do is just set the issue output or issues output to nothing. And I want to make sure that there are issues, because if it comes back as an empty array, then we just want to show like no issues found or something like that. So let's say if, and we'll say if issues dot length is equal to 0, then let's take the output, so issues output, and we'll set the inner HTML. Whoops, I meant to do that up top. This up here should be dot inner HTML. All right, so we want to set this inner HTML, and we'll set it to, let's do an H4, and we'll just say no issues found. Okay, and then an else. So if there are issues, then we're gonna want to loop through them and then output something for each one. So let's take issues and let's use the for each array method here, and this takes in a function, and we'll say for each one we'll call it issue. And then in here let's construct an output variable, and this is going to be a template string. So we want to use backticks here, and we'll have a class of card, and let's do MB5, so margin bottom 5. When I use Emmet inside of template strings, it actually adds class name, I think because I have it set up for JSX, so I'm just going to make sure that I remove that. And then let's do card-body, and then sometimes Emmet doesn't even work. So div class, set that to card body. And inside the card body here, we're going to have an H4. It's not working. So H4, and in that H4 is going to be the message. So remember, we have a message, we have a context, which is the HTML, and then we have a code, which I want to display as well. So here, let's do issue.message. All right, and then let's see, under the H4, we're going to have a paragraph with the class of bg-light, and let's do padding 3, and then margin on the top and bottom, so my3, and just make sure I get rid of that class name. All right, and then in here, this is where we want to show the context, but remember, it's HTML, and we don't want it to render. So we're going to have a function called escape HTML. So we'll create that in a second, and then we'll pass in here the issue.context. All right, now down here where we have the escape HTML comment is where we're going to create the function. I'm actually going to paste it in because it's just a bunch of replaces. So we're using regular expressions here to replace certain characters. And basically to output, like let's say an H1 tag, to have the left angle bracket, you would use this, ampersand LT semicolon. That would output a left angle bracket. The right angle bracket would be this, GT. Okay, we also want quotes, so we're just replacing certain characters so that we can output the HTML instead of actually rendering it. So if we put like an A tag, it's not going to show a link and create a link. It's going to just show the A, href, whatever. So that function, we're just wrapping around this issues context. And then let's go under this paragraph. Let's create another one. We'll call this, or we'll give this a class of BG secondary, and let's do text-light and a little bit of padding, so P-2. And let me just make sure I get rid of this class name. That should be just class. And in here, this is going to be the code. So I'm going to just do code : and then we'll do issue.code. All right, now we're looping through the issues. We're creating this output template for each one, but we need to obviously put it into the DOM. So I'm going to go underneath where the template ends, underneath that backtick, and then let's take our issues output and then .inner HTML, and we're going to set that to that particular output for that iteration. Okay, I'm sorry, this needs to be plus equals because we're appending it. We want to keep adding them. We don't want to just replace the issue before that. So that should do it. Let's save and let's reload, and then let's throw traversy.dev in there and submit. It's going to take a second. And there we go. So it's outputting all of the messages. So it has the message, it has the context, and it's not rendering the HTML because of that escape HTML function. And then we're also just displaying the code at the bottom here as well. Now I have this actual, the page that we're testing, the Traversy Dev, I have that available. So I'm going to bring that over and just correct those issues, and we can then try it again. So let me just grab this real quick. All right, so I'm going to bring that index.html over. So this is the traversy.dev web page, and obviously you guys can't do this part. You can test your own websites, but just to show you, go through some of these. So the image element is missing the alt. That's pretty self-explanatory. We just want to add alt to that, and it shows us exactly what it's talking about. So this image one. And then let's see, we have this element has insufficient contrast, the paragraph with the text light, which is this right here. So I could change, where right here, the styling. So the color is very light. I could change that to something different, but I probably wouldn't call it text light. You just call it, I don't know, we'll call it text color, and then change that here. I mean, this is just to give you an example. And then anchor element found with a valid href, but no link content has been supplied. So it's talking about this, the Twitter, and how we're just wrapping a link around a Font Awesome icon with no text. So you could add text here, but if you don't want to, if you just want the icon, what you could do is add a span with the class of sr-only, and whatever you put in here shouldn't display on the web page, but it will fix this issue. And then the last, let's see, the form does not contain a submit button. That's pretty obvious. So button, add a type of submit. And then the other two are referring to the label not having a for attribute. So we could add for, set that to the same as the ID of the input. All right, so now what I'm going to do is save this, and I'm going to push it back to traversy.dev so we can test this again. So just give me 1 second to just push this back. All right, so now I should be able to resubmit this, and we should get no errors. There we go, no issues found. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this little project, and I will see you next time.